So guys, let's start from here and let's talk about some homeostatic imbalances, specifically what can lead to weakening of the heart. And those have to do with our valves. And so there's the first one that's called the incompetent valve. And basically this means the valve isn't working right. And so blood is backflowing into the heart. So the heart is having to repump the same blood over and over again. We talked a little bit about this in lab when we talked about how they form those little bowls or cusps to help them to close so that blood doesn't go back into the heart. And so when they don't perform that function correctly and they don't close, then essentially the heart is having to do double the work. Now, what's equally as bad is valvular stenosis. So, valvular stenosis is the idea that the flaps or these valves become extremely constricted, so the flaps aren't opening correctly. And so, essentially, for the valves to be opened and the blood to be forced, the heart needs to exert even more force. And so, this can cause a problem too. Now, both of these can lead to conditions that severely weaken the heart, but there are possibilities to fix them in the sense of being replaced. So these defective valves can be replaced with some kind of mechanical valve that allows the heart to work properly, an animal valve that can be replaced from some other animal like a pig, or cadaver valve. Now, when we talk about how the blood, the pathway through the heart that the blood follows, we talked about this in lab, so let's talk and go through each one of these. And so we start with the blood entering into the heart on the right side. And so they come from the top of the body, drains through the superior vena cava. The bottom of the body drains through the inferior vena cava. And then the heart drains from the coronary sinus. And they go into the right atrium. I'm doing all shorthand for this. Through the right atrium, it's going to go into the bottom half of the heart, but it's going to do that through the tricuspid valve. Once it goes through the tricuspid valve, it will be in the right ventricle. And through the right ventricle, it's going to pump and it's going to push blood out of the heart through the pulmonary valve. Now through there, we're going to go through the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries. Now all this blood is deoxygenated, as in it doesn't have any oxygen in it. So we are essentially going to the lungs so that we can obtain oxygen. Normally when you hear arteries, it means it's going away. And for the bottom part of the body or the other part, this is what's called the pulmonary system. It's going up into the lungs and coming back down, and then the heart is going to basically push everything else through the entire body into what's called the systemic system. And that means that the arteries are going to hold oxygenated blood. But for this case, it is deoxy. Now, once it comes from the lungs, basically it's going to go into the left side, which is the four pulmonary veins are going to come back, two from each side. And then it's going to go into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it's going to go through the mitral or bicuspid valve. Here, it's going to enter into the left ventricle, then go to the aortic valve, and then systemic circulation. So that's going to, through the systemic circulation out of the aorta. And so that's the basically pathway of the blood through the heart. And so basically this is showing you that the heart is a double pump and each side is supplying its own circuitry. So if you look here, we start with the superior inferior vena cava and this coronary sinuses, and it goes out and through this way. So essentially it goes right atrium, tricuspid, right ventricle, pulmonary, semilunar valve, and then through the pulmonary trunk. And you can see it's all blue, which means that it's oxygen poor blood. So you can see the blood here coming in, right? Then it's going into the right ventricle and out here. And then from here, basically it's going to go here into the lungs, and you can see these are the capillaries. These are really, really tiny, And so these are going to be really close to the tissue and the oxygen. So oxygen is going to be able to diffuse from the lungs into these capillaries and go back into the heart. And then from here, you can see now it's red because it is oxygen rich. And so from here, it's going to go, you can see the two pulmonary veins on both sides going into the left atrium, going through the bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle going through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. And then from there, it's going to go to the body. And then once it goes to the body, essentially you can see it goes into the systemic capillary. So these are going to be basically what is really close to things like the liver or the kidneys or any of these other, the pancreas, anything else throughout the body. And then once it uses its oxygen, it's going to come out and then go back through to the heart. So it has pulmonary circuitry up here, and this down here ends up going to the systemic.
Right atrium, the ventricular vena cava. It flows down through the cuspid valve, it won't go back up. Stays in right ventricle until it contracts. Yeah, it's pumped up to the conus arteriosus. Pulmonary semilunar valve into the trunk, yeah. And every time it goes out through your arteries, I say, hey, that's pulmonary circulation. It goes into the lungs, back into your heart, the left side of your heart. Hey, don't forget, the blood gets oxygenated, and pulmonary veins take blood back to your heart. Left atrium must relax and blood flows through bicuspid. Left ventricle contracts and forces the valve open. Aortic vestibule, oh, you are so smooth. Oh, you know, aortic semilunar. You close your valve so blood goes up and not backwards. Oh, the aortic arch is where it passes through and it flows out. No, that's when it goes to other organs and tissues. Heart, you're amazing. Systemic circulation. And by the way, that took only 0.8 seconds. This blood flow's amazing. It keeps us alive.
So basically, we're talking about this pathway of blood through the heart, and equal volumes of blood are pumped to the pulmonary and systemic circuits, right? The pulmonary circuit is the shortest, and just remember, this does have the lowest pressure. It doesn't have to travel as far, guys. It's very much close. Think how close in proximity the heart is to the lungs. The systemic circuit, though, is much larger, and it has a lot more friction. You have to think there's a lot more blood vessels that we're pumping blood through. So it's going to create more pressure. And so the anatomy of the ventricles is what reflects this differences. And if you remember when we looked in the, when we actually looked in the heart, the left ventricle was so much thicker. It's about 3 times as thick as the right. And that's basically to help generate enough pressure to allow blood to flow through the higher level of friction in the circulation. So now let's go on to coronary circulation. And this is basically the functional blood supply that goes to and from the heart muscle itself. Remember, it's composed of arteries and veins. And we talked about this in lab. Just because the blood is going through the heart itself doesn't mean that it's actually supplying the blood to the heart. We have a set of separate coronary arteries and coronary veins to take blood to the heart and to bring it back. And the thing is when we talked about blood entering into the right atrium, we talked about blood entering through the coronary sinus. And that is the area that blood is coming from the rest of the heart that has basically is oxygen poor to go through and flow through the body so that it can, or go through the heart so that it can go to the lungs. And so when we're talking about this, we are talking about the coronary arteries, and they arise from the base of the aorta and supply the arterial blood to the heart. And essentially, there are two main arteries. You have the left coronary artery, and I'm going to show you basically what this supplies. Just to let you know, it supplies the intraventricular septum, the anterior ventricular walls, the left atrium, and posterior walls of the left ventricle. And essentially, it has two branches that we're going to look at. And the branches are the anterior intraventricular artery and the circumflex artery. The right coronary artery supplies the right atrium and most of the right ventricle. So you can think this one is mostly or focused on the right, and it branches as well into the right marginal artery. I'm just going to put A there, and the posterior ventricular artery. Now, all the blood throughout the heart is going to be collected primarily through capillary beds and then funneled into the cardiac veins. And those cardiac veins are going to be dumped into the coronary sinus that empties into the right atrium. And this is essentially formed by the merging of all these veins. And that essentially gets three major veins that are collecting. And those that dump into there are basically the great cardiac vein, the middle cardiac vein, and the small cardiac vein. And so let's look at these guys on the next picture. So we can start here, and you can see the left coronary artery. And this comes down here, and you'll notice it bifurcates right here. And that top one is the circumflex artery that we talked about. And down here is that anterior ventricular artery. And you can see it's towards the middle, so it does supply the intraventricular septum. The anterior part of the ventricle walls, you can see that. The left atrium at the top. And also the posterior part of the ventricular wall. So it kind of takes all this stuff mostly on the left, as you can see. If you look at the right coronary artery, that's right here, you can see that it comes in through here. And this guy continues on the back, and essentially he will lead claim to the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. You can see those are in the back because this guy continues to go around here. This is the right, and then back here you end up getting that posterior intraventricular artery. And so that mostly supplies the right side. When we get into veins, you can see what I was talking about with the great cardiac vein. The coronary sinus is this big one that's here. This guy is going to basically go in the back and connect with him. You can see this middle one is already back there and connects with him. And then the small one goes around and connects right there. And all of this is going to dump over here into the right atrium. So just so that you could see it a little bit better here, here is the big coronary sinus that is going to essentially dump all the blood. And you can see all of these major major veins dump into him so that he can dump blood into the right atrium. So angina pectoris, let me just mention really quick before I forget. The left ventricle does get most of the coronary blood supply. I think it's doing the most work. So it does need extra there. And it kind of is explained by just the main thickness of it as well. Sorry about that, forgot. So the angina pectoris is homeostatic imbalance. So thoracic pain that's caused by a fleeting deficit in blood delivery to the myocardium. So in this, it's going to be very painful and the cells are going to weaken and can cause problems with your heart functioning correctly. So let's learn a little bit about that.
Angina is most often a symptom of a heart problem called coronary heart disease or coronary artery disease. Your heart pumps oxygen-rich blood to all parts of your body. Your heart needs a steady supply of oxygen to do its job. Coronary arteries bring oxygen-rich blood to your heart. These important blood vessels are located on the surface of your heart. In a healthy heart, blood flows freely through the coronary arteries. The blood brings oxygen to the heart so it can work properly. In coronary heart disease, the coronary arteries become stiff and narrow, so less blood and oxygen flow to your heart. After exercise or emotional stress, low blood flow can lead to angina, pain or discomfort in the chest, arm, shoulder, neck, back, or jaw. Angina that keeps coming back over time is called chronic stable angina. It is most often relieved by rest or nitroglycerin. A clot in a coronary artery can severely lower blood flow. This can lead to more severe angina that may come on at rest and does not go away with rest or nitroglycerin. This is called unstable angina, which requires immediate medical attention. In summary, when blood flow is reduced, your heart does not get as much oxygen as it needs. This lack of oxygen is what causes the pain and discomfort of angina. If you have coronary heart disease, angina is the way your heart tells you it needs more oxygen.
So basically, just to let you know, the arteries within your heart contain many anastomoses. Anastomosis. And these are basically junctions. And these can help provide additional routes for blood delivery, but they can't compensate for things like this coronary artery occlusions. And so this can cause problems. Now, overall, the heart does receive about a 20th of the blood supply to keep functioning. So there's quite a bit of the blood that actually gets diverted into the heart because it's working very, very hard. And so if we cut off that blood supply, it can create devastating effects. Now, I love mitochondria, don't I? A myocardial infarction is a heart attack. And prolonged coronary blockages can cause this to happen. And basically, what happens is that areas of the cells actually undergo cell death. And when they're repaired with non contractile scar tissue. So it's going to make things much, much harder to pump blood because they're not going to be able to contract like they did before because the scar tissue is going to be very fibrotic.
Because the heart must continually beat, the coronary arteries serve a critical role, supplying the constantly active heart muscle with oxygenated blood. As we zoom in to observe the interior of this diseased coronary artery, notice the partially restricted blood flow due to the atherosclerotic plaque in the arterial wall. If part of this plaque ruptures, a thrombus forms and may grow and occlude the vessel. The thrombus detaches, causing an embolism, obstructing the blood flow through the artery. Since the supply of blood has been obstructed from reaching the region of the heart supplied by this artery, the myocardial cells become ischemic, resulting in damage to the heart muscle. Symptoms of a myocardial infarction may include shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, intense prolonged chest pain, nausea, fainting, and intense sweating, pain in the left shoulder, arm, jaw, and back.
So that tells a little bit about what can happen if the heart doesn't get the needed oxygen that it needs. Now, the heart is made up of cardiac muscle cells, and they are striated, they're short, they're branched, they're kind of fat and thick, and they're interconnected. There's one central nuclei, at most two, in each cardiac muscle. They do have what's called intercalated disc. These are connecting junctions, like gap junctions, between cardiac cells. They can contain desmosomes that hold, sorry, I'm having some problem. Okay. Okay, we're just going to do it this way because for some reason my thing is not working. Let me try it again. It is causing me some problems right here, and I'm really close, so I don't want to have to redo this again. So here it goes. So it helps to hold cells together, if you remember this from the first part of this class, and the gap junctions are allowed for ions to pass between the actual cells. And so these intercalated discs are really, really important because it allows the heart to undergo what's called syncytium. And this is basically them beating in a coordinated single unit. So syncytium. Now, what's really cool about these guys is that they don't get tired. this muscle tissue does not get tired. It doesn't get tired because it's about 25 to 30% mitochondria. Per volume. So it's going to be able to make all the ATP it can to allow the muscle to contract correctly. And you can see here on how it's put together. These are the intercalated disc. These are the nuclei, right? You can see slightly the striation between the I and A bands. And this kind of shows you how they're put together. These are the openings to allow ions. This helps the cells or the myocyte to stay together. They don't pull apart during contraction. Now, the space between the cells do have connective tissue called endomysium. And there's numerous capillaries here, and they connect cardiac muscle to cardiac skeletons, giving the cell something to pull against. And so you might remember just the look of this as well, that they have some of the same thing. You have the A band here. If you remember, you have the Z disc. That's going to kind of hold that actin into place. And then here you can see that you have the thick filaments, which is the myosin, the thin filaments, which is the actin. This A band is going to be the area that is overlap between the actin and myosin before. You have this H zone down here, if you remember that, which doesn't have any of the actin. The M line here in the middle. And so that's kind of how the sarcomere works, or the different parts of the sarcomere. The T-tubules here are actually wider than in skeletal muscle like we had before, but there's less of them. So they are a little bit different, as you can see there, compared to what we learned previously. And this just kind of shows you a microscopic so that you can see it a little bit larger, and then you can see that endomysium there, that white area in between the different cells. Of course, how are the physiological differences of skeletal and cardiac muscles? The similarities are that the muscle contraction is preceded by depolarization action potential. So what happened in last semester, if you remember, we talked about how essentially you have a neurotransmitter. The one we talked about before was acetylcholine coming across, and it attaches to receptors that open ion channels and then allow that that action potential to go down the T-tubules, causing calcium to be released. So that general process remains the same between the skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. The depolarization travels down the T-tubules, causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, just like before. Excitation, contraction, coupling occurs. Calcium binds troponin, causing filaments to slide. Remember, because troponin basically moves out of the way, so tropomyosin is exposed and myosin can bind it. Now, the differences is that the cardiac muscles are self-excitable. They're not having a neurotransmitter come from the nervous system to allow it to happen. It is self-excitable, and we're going to talk about that later in this lecture. It contracts as a unit, the entire heart, from all the muscle, not just like one muscle fiber or one muscle itself. The entire heart contracts as a unit. The influx of calcium from extracellular fluid triggers calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is different than what we had above. The tectonic contractions cannot occur in the cardiac muscles, and that the heart relies mostly exclusively on anaerobic respiration. So this is just showing you kind of similarities, the structures between skeletal muscles, striated, long, cylindrical, and multinucleated, where this is 1 or 2 nucleated. It is short, branched, and the commonality here is that it's striated. Everything else is different. Cardiac muscle has gap junctions. Skeletal muscle does not. It helps it to be in a coordinated single unit. This, it doesn't unless the motor nerve units are stimulated individually and activate. T-tubule, they're abundant in skeletal muscle. There's fewer of them, but they're wider. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is very elaborate and has terminal cisternae. This doesn't have terminal cisternae, thus no triads. This comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum only. This, you can get it from the extracellular fluid as well. Calcium binds troponin is the same. This has pacemaker cells. So this is actually going to be self-contractile, where this doesn't have it, so it's going to get it from an outside source. Tetanus happens here, where it doesn't happen here. And this is aerobic, more mitochondria, and this can be aerobic or anaerobic, right? If there's not enough oxygen that gets there, it'll go anaerobic, thus it has fewer mitochondria. So that's kind of going through, and we're going to stop here, and the next video will start. Thank you for your patience, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.